Before we start, I'd like to apologise for the quality of my footage. I didn't realise it at the time, but it has come out quite laggy, full of frame drops and other nasties. It looks like shit, and I'm afraid this might be one of my worst videos as a result. Lucky I'm still a minute channel, so it doesn't matter much. These frame rate issues didn't actually affect me when I was playing the game. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to play the game, and I would have had to turn my settings down. What I think has happened is that the game was so demanding on my aging PC that recording and playing the game at the same time meant that the recording suffered in quality as memory and processing power was hogged by the actual game that pushed my PC to the limit. Fact is, I'm not going to go back and record better quality footage, and I'm just going to live with this video looking terrible and amateurish. But hey, I'm a beginner YouTuber, and them's the punches I have to roll with. Maybe one day I'll have a better PC and not have to worry about issues like this. In the meantime, all I can do is offer my sincere apologies, and if you have to click off this video because you can't stand it, oh well. At least I learned something from making it. Thanks for your understanding. On to the show. 13 years after the original, Saber Interactive have taken up the mantle and released a sequel to one of the most well-loved and remembered Warhammer 40,000 games. And more importantly, one of the 40,000 games that put character, story, and putting yourself viscerally in the boots of a Space Marine at the centre of its gameplay. The Space Marine games aren't about abstract 40k themed gameplay, but about depicting the lore and world of a Space Marine cinematically. From my point of view, this means that Saber have set themselves a hard challenge in that they are releasing a sequel for a single-player story-driven campaign that is a multiplayer-focused co-op campaign. I didn't know what exactly to expect coming into Space Marine 2, and for me the fact that there is no facet of the game that isn't multiplayer was a huge letdown, and I understand that the multiplayer on the original game was a big part of its success, but so was the very single-player focused campaign, and unfortunately for me, I'm just not at a point in my life where multiplayer is what I'm looking for. Now, does this mean the game is bad, or doesn't have something to offer a single player looking for their grim dank Space Marine story? No, it doesn't. The game is fantastic. But the gist of this video is that Space Marine 2 was, for me, an experience that I both absolutely loved and was fraught with incredible frustration. And I feel like most of this frustration came from the conflict between the multiplayer first design and my single player desires. You better get used to that. I'm going to carry on about it a lot. I may have had some pretty bad times with this game, but they aren't because it's a bad game at all, but because I'm not really with the times anymore. I'm a dinosaur, a bit of a gaming grandpa. The original Space Marines conventions, aims and goals I was very familiar and comfortable with, but Space Marine 2 not so much. To quote The Simpsons, Space Marine 2 made me feel like Grandpa when he says, "I used to be with it, but then they changed what it was. Now what I'm with isn't it, and what's it seems weird and scary to me, and it'll happen to you too." Well, it has definitely happened to me. What I'm getting at is that in some ways, what I have to say about this game is unfair, as I didn't really engage with it fairly, as it was intended to be played. I outright didn't even try heaps of the content. I only played through the main campaign and that was it. With the original game that was fair enough. It was only the campaign and multiplayer servers. But Space Marine 2 has a bunch of multiplayer PvE operations, as they are called, and they even tie into the events of the story campaign. And I honestly wanted to play them, but I didn't want to play them with strangers, which I admit is my choice. But then I'd need buddies who also wanted to and were available to play them. Or I could play them with bots, but Saber haven't made that an easy thing to do. requiring you to disconnect your PC from the net or put Steam in offline mode, and I just felt that that was such an obtuse way for me to experience the content on my own that I just didn't bother. Saber clearly aren't aiming for single players like me. If somehow magically this game came out when I was 16 to 24 years old and a student with time and had lots of friends who had similar schedules to me who could play with me, I might think this was one of the greatest games ever made. And honestly, I'm pretty jealous of anyone who does have this situation going on. It honestly looks like a blast. But alas, with my middle-aged shift work, friends who like the same games and are able to play them at the same time, which is the big critical thing, well, they're pretty rare for me, especially consistently to experience a story-based game. It's just not going to happen. Like, let me level for you. If I finish work at 2 in the morning and get home at 3, and I don't have work the next day, I might boot up a game and play for a few hours, and ain't no one going to be available for me. Then I wake up in the middle of the day and everybody's at work. If you know what I mean. At my age and with what's going on in my life, I just don't really have the context to be co-oping a game like this. So, as I go through my experience, almost every specific issue I had always came back to this tension between multiplayer design and single player experience. And ultimately, that problem lies with me, and not intrinsically with the game itself. So, be warned, any aging millennials out there who also don't have the context in their lives for multiplayer good times, co-op or otherwise, this game can be deeply frustrating, as well as gloriously fun and absorbing. So before we really get into it, I'll spare a few words for my usual menu and titles rundown. I can report that mostly we have nothing to worry about from this game in terms of its menus and titles. It does appear to have an out-of-game loader of some description, but it doesn't involve a menu, it's just a logoed box that flashes up for 30 seconds for the game's anti-cheat software, which touches on something I'll get to in just a moment. After that, we get a pretty snappy and fast series of your regular title screens and the press the key to continue holding screen with a Space Marine doing a nice silhouette shoulder dance in the background for you. And I'll note it's one of the new Primaris Space Marines. No cinematic intro here, just minimalism. Straight into the titles, the music is what you'd expect, manly chanting, deep brass, booming percussion. Press the button and you get a surprisingly long little bit of loading before you get a very short menu, and Silhouette Marine gets lit up a bit more and is revealed to be a bit bloody and clearly has some kind of spark throwing fire nearby, getting him all red-hued and battle-torn. This is a pretty minimal approach compared to the battle animations of Titus executing orcs in the original game. Times have changed, and they want to present that shit to you cinematically with some mystery and build-up in the game, not slap you in the face with it on the menu, like in 2011. Up in the top left, we can see our Steam username signed in. The bottom left says, hit escape to quit the game, rather than give you a whole button for it. And the bottom right has some nonsense about logging into yet another account with a QR code. Look, I'll cut to the chase. Along with the anti-cheat right at the start before the game boots and all the logging in, extra loading time, and when you do play the game, it makes sure to tell you you are joining a server even when you are playing by yourself. Yeah, this is the moment I knew when I first booted the game that this was an online all the time game, even for players like me who are playing by themselves. I don't hold it against the game and the developers in general. If I were an objective reviewer and not just some guy giving my opinion on the internet, this isn't a problem, not in 2024, but personally, I really fucking wish it didn't do this and that I didn't have to engage with a goddamn micron of multiplayer online infrastructure until I hit a button that said multiplayer. I wanted to just play a locally run single player game. The fact that there is no multiplayer button on this menu and the game is fundamentally a multiplayer title right down to its opening loader and menu infrastructure is at the heart of a lot of my personal gripes with this game. Of course, in objective review land, it's not an issue and I don't hold it against Saber. They've made an amazing game for way more people and a much more successful business choice to boot by choosing to do it this way. I'm happy to admit I just wanted an offline single player campaign like the original, and I'm the outlier here. But I'll never not criticize an always online game if it wants to present a legitimate single player experience. As we will discover, any single player game will always be somewhat compromised if it is fundamentally built from the ground up to be a multiplayer experience first. And I do lament what could have been had they chosen not to do it this way, even if Saber are right that it would have been the dumb way to go about it in 2024. It's just a personal preference of mine. And even here on the menu, it kind of sucks that I have to wait a little while for the online connection stuff to happen when it could have been instantaneous until I hit a multiplayer button. I like my single player games local to my computer, thanks, and I think they are better that way. Now, getting back to the menu. 3 of the 4 options aren't much worth talking about. Continue, new game, and credits. We know what these are about. The settings option is worth praising for this game because unlike the predecessor, this setting menu rocks. It's full of options. We are talking 7 tabs of settings. Game, video, controls, camera, audio, interface, and accessibility. Each of these tabs has a plethora of options, some of which are super nice extra luxuries to have, like being able to choose your target monitor to play the game on, or camera shake on and off, motion blur on and off, the dynamic range of the audio, a dozen HUD display options, half a dozen subtitle options. There's even a colorblind mode. This is an opulent settings menu, and Saber Interactive is doing everyone proud with this, and this is one of the reasons I like to include a bit about the menu in my videos. I believe a culture of praising well done menus is a good thing to have. Far too many modern games provide way too little in the way of options, and seeing this many preferences to make the game sing my personal song, or indeed yours, so it works for us, is exactly what I love to see in a video game, especially a PC platform video game. There is one option I wish they had here and they don't, and I will talk on that later in the video, as it turned out to be a bit of a big deal, personally just for me, but otherwise, wrap this settings menu up with a ribbon and give it away for Christmas. Thanks for the thoughtful gift, Saber. There is much to talk about in regards to the difficulty choices which are available in the settings and on New Game, but that discussion will be in the rest of the video. For now, listen. I put a spoilers thing in all my videos just in case, but seriously, this video will be nothing but absolutely major spoilers. Do not watch if you want to play for yourself or haven't already played the game. Rather than start with New Game and the story, let's start with general critique and gameplay discussion and get back to that later. So, some of the general big ticket positives I'm here to praise are the stability, graphics, sound, design, and detail of the game. Basically, all the production values are insane. In my video for the 2011 original game, I called it a B movie in comparison to 2011's big ticket titles. Well, that ain't the case for the sequel. This is a blockbuster of a game with some of the most exquisite, opulent excesses of detail I have ever had the pleasure to see in any game. In every way, this game is childhood me's wet dream of a Warhammer 40,000 game in terms of the spectacle of the delivery of the setting. Whether the models, the textures, the aesthetics of the levels, The atmosphere of the levels, the sheer amount of shit on the screen that is going down at any one time. This game delivers beyond my wildest dreams in terms of bringing 40k scenes off the page of a codex and to life in front of your eyes. Never has an adaptation realised the details so thoroughly. It's in the armour of the Marines, the interior of the big spaceships, the foliage in the jungle, the architecture of the buildings in the cities, the action happening in the background of any given scene, the giant gun structures towering in the distance, the slaver of a tyrannid, the sparks and smoke that sputter out of a thunderhawk. It's absolutely every single little thing in this game, and it feels like the models and miniatures brought to life, the very world of 40k brought to life. It is extremely impressive to capture and animate decades of imagination so vividly, especially depicting the sheer scale of 40k, whether that's spacecraft, battles, cities, or the supernatural. Even if you weren't into 40k, you would have to admit how impressive this all is visually, and I have a feeling this aspect, more than any other, is what will sell 40k to newbies when they play this game. It just looks so swank. And all that, and it runs well too. I don't have an especially powerful machine by 2024 standards, and I'm sure it helps I'm running at 1080p, but I had no crashes, major bugs or glitches or issues. I certainly wasn't running it on the highest graphics, but I wasn't turning anything down either. Bizarrely, I ran into some FPS slowdown, freezing and jumping during the apex of a particularly action-packed pre-rendered cutscene of all things, and not especially during gameplay or in-engine cutscenes, and that only happened once, so it gets a pass. Especially as it was only a few seconds, and if I really want to watch it without an issue, it'd be easy to just look up. I criticised 2011 Space Marine for having generic music, but music that nails the brief. Space Marine 2 is just all-round fantastic music that is as equally bombastic and engaging as the visuals it accompanies. I still wouldn't listen to it for pleasure or hum it to myself at the shops. It's not Heroes of Might and Magic 3 or some other king shit masterpiece soundtrack. Honestly, it's probably not in my top 100 video game music list, but I never felt like it was generic like I did with the original or anything other than fantastic. It always elevated every single moment it was used in the game, and you can't ask for anything more than that. The sound effects were every bit as good as the first games, if not better. The bolter sound is absolutely in the top 5 bolter depictions in video games, although maybe not the actual bolter itself, but the sound. Every single weapon, explosion, sound effect, monster, and bit of tech is wonderfully realised and engaging. The voice acting is also spot on, although I will mention our playable protagonist Titus has very obviously had a change of voice actor, which is highly understandable in a production 13 years after the previous one. I must admit I preferred his old voice, which was a beyond cliche, self-assured, heroic action hero voice. His new voice sounds much more like a generic Space Marine voice, like the ones the regular nameless Marines in Dawn of War have. So it's appropriate in that sense. But what really sold me for the new voice was how ragged and rough it is. It's believable Titus's voice has changed into this, because in the intervening times between the games, Titus has clearly been through a whole storm of shit, and the new voice absolutely conveys this, and the comparison between the voices conveys it. I think even though I liked the old voice better, it wouldn't have been anywhere near as appropriate for the character as he appears in this game. Every other character has fantastic voice acting too. I particularly love the main antagonist's voice, as well as anything Tech Priest related, especially when they go all dial-up modem sounding. This game was clearly made by people who weren't just fans of the original game and what it was trying to do, but must be huge fans of 40k in general, as the absolute love for the property and depicting it well oozes out of every single pixel and frame of the game, and I guarantee they will be hauling in an entire ocean of new fans for Games Workshop with this property. On so many levels, this is the dream game 40k fans have been looking for their entire lives, and boy does it make me excited about what's waiting in the future that could top this one for the coolest depictions of the property out there. If you wanted passion about Warhammer 40,000, look no further. This is the biggest bombshell you could have asked for in 2024 in that regard, and of course, it's not flawless, but it is very, very good. So why did I have issues with it? Have I admitted enough that it's my own fault yet? Well, I want to be clear about that, so I'll say it again. It's my own doing. I played a co-op game by myself on the hardest difficulty, and that is my problem. I did this because that's how I played the previous game. And sure, it wasn't a co-op game, and I died a bunch, but it was the right difficulty for me. So based on that, I went into this one with the same approach. I didn't know at the start how much the co-op aspect would factor into the single-player campaign. At first it was okay, I was dying, but that's fine. I was very impressed with the basics of the new combat system. It seemed to address most of my issues with the previous game's combat system, which you can watch the video I made on it if you want to hear about it in detail, but the gist is, in the previous game you got your health back by performing executions, but you weren't invulnerable performing executions, so you kept dying mid-combat whenever you got locked into the animation, and it just felt like the game was interrupting its own momentum the mechanic was designed to preserve. This game opened by telling me you get your health back from damage just by damaging enemies within a certain contested amount of health, and executions, which now return armor instead of health, make you invulnerable during the animations. Fantastic. That's the majority of the previous game's systems I found disappointing addressed immediately. On top of that, you have a far more nuanced system with well-timed parries and counters and dodges. I went in so happy, feeling like Saber got it, and this was really going to be so much fun. What I failed to understand was that the campaign was really designed for co-op, and thus I suspect the difficulty was tuned for co-op too. Sure, you can absolutely play it as a single player, and I don't want to pretend it isn't surmountable as a single player or anything, but there's a whole lot of design choices that give away that it is not the intended experience. On top of that, I get the feeling that the new combat is designed for a gaming world that's digested and mastered Souls-like games and other more modern combat systems. And here's me never having played any From Software or any Souls-like titles in my life. And this is why I felt old and out of depth with the combat system. I reckon there's plenty of player out there more engaged with games of this style who took to it like ducks to water. So that is also on me. I also feel that the game didn't necessarily do a good job explaining the combat system. Like, initially I thought they did, but then I found myself constantly failing at parrying and dodging when the blue parry marker and red dodge marker went off, as the game told me to do. Once again, this is probably my bad for misunderstanding, but eventually I looked it up and was relieved to find others struggling with it too, although there were plenty saying it was easy as well. Anyway, I found a key bit of info I hadn't realised. I felt like a fool after I read it. So, the red and blue markers don't tell you when to hit the relevant button to do the relevant action, like a rhythm game, i.e., I see red, hit the button. No, the red and blue indicators warn you to pay attention to the animation of the model that's about to target you with that action, and then time your dodge or parry based on that. So, you see the red, wait until the mob's animation is just about to fire off the attack, or the split second after they have fired off the attack, and then hit the dodge button for a perfectly timed dodge. Subtle, but huge difference that made the game so much easier for me once I knew that. A lot of people are probably laughing at me. It should have been obvious that's what was happening, but that's why I call myself an old dinosaur here. I genuinely didn't put two and two together. I feel like if they hadn't have had the blue and red indicators at all, I would have cottoned on a bit sooner, especially given that you can parry and dodge animations even without them. They're just there to help warn you they're coming. They're not there as like a solid rhythm game exercise. And honestly, once I knew that, I much more often successfully parried and dodged. One other issue I had with the melee combat that really would have made it a lot easier for me would have been if it had split into two buttons like in the original game, the melee attack button. And this is what I meant earlier when I talked about my one issue with the settings menu. In this game, you use combinations of tapping the melee attack button and holding it down. So, say you could tap 3 times, hold it down on the 4th time to perform a combo, as opposed to tap A button 3 times and hit B on the 4th to perform the same combo. It's only a little thing, and maybe it didn't make much difference for most players, but this seriously messed with my personal mojo and timing, and my brain did not enjoy trying to navigate the blurry lines between what's a short press or a long hold, especially under pressure. And if in some magical world Saber listened to me about something, it is please give me an option in the key binding menu to turn the hold melee attack button into a separate button. Maybe that won't work for controller players, but I have a whole keyboard worth of buttons and a mouse with multiple buttons. I can spare one to make this aspect more intuitive and snappy and easier to juggle in my grandpa gaming brain. Speaking of, I thought the default configuration for mouse and keyboard players was atrocious, and developed a rebinding that also made the game much easier. You know, right click to zoom in, middle click to throw grenade, and I used extra mouse 4 and 5 for melee and parry. But they could have easily been keyboard keys. That might just be a me thing again, but I couldn't stand their default bindings. In general, I struggled with the difficulty, which once again is my bad, given I could have and should have just selected an easier difficulty. And at one point in the game I got brutally stuck, and I did indeed go down from the hardest Angel of Death difficulty to the second hardest Veteran difficulty, which was a good move for me. I continued to die all the time, but no longer would I get stuck for huge periods of time. Instead, I found myself constantly only just scraping through, which honestly is a good point to have a difficulty setting in a game, in my opinion, as it means that you are constantly feeling challenged and having to adapt and evolve your game to improve. The problem was that I didn't feel much in control. I felt like it was just a randomish scramble most of the time, and that matters because it wasn't selling the Space Marine trademark experience. Titus dodge rolling constantly around the screen, ineffectually shooting stuff, waiting for a red blinking mob to enter a stock standard animation, did not feel or look like a Space Marine fighting. The original game felt way more like Space Marines fighting. I guarantee that a player good at the game probably did look and feel like a Space Marine, but I looked like a silly video game player roly-polying in a circle. The disconnect was massive, and that was really quite annoying. The entire power fantasy that you play the game for was essentially being ruined by the gameplay. So it was either turn the difficulty down even though I was at an ideal challenge point to get the powerful Space Marine experience, or slog through. And I slogged through, although I probably shouldn't have. I should have turned it down. I will note that about halfway through the game, this got better for a reason I'll get to in a bit. I do genuinely feel that the ranged combat in this game, at least for most bolter weapons in the single player, isn't balanced right, even on the hard difficulties. I felt like the cutscenes accurately depict how effective the bolter should be. You shouldn't have to unload multiple clips into all but the toughest of standard enemies. The really little critters should only take 1 or 2 shots, big critters maybe a whole clip or just over. The bolter sounded and looked good, but played so ridiculously inefficient, I found it only really useful for slowly bleeding bosses down. A few of the other weapons were better, but overall I felt ranged was not selling the experience at all, and melee was the only effective way to fight outside a handful of late game weapons. And grenades, of course. I feel like Space Marine 2 could take a good look at Bolt Gun or the original Space Marine's hardest difficulty for examples of how to balance the range damage so the game is more fun and feels better. But this is perhaps where the co-op design begins to rear its head. I can see how if you are playing this game on the harder difficulties in co-op with real human squad mates, coordinating ranged might actually be a way more viable and effective tactic. And in general on the harder difficulties, I very much got the impression that most things might be way more viable and effective when coupled with actual human teamwork. So many things indicate this is a primary objective of the design. To start with the smallest hints, whenever you reload, pick something up or press a switch, you get a little timing indicator that counts down showing how long it takes to perform these actions. In the case of reloads, your character shouts "reload!" and you excruciatingly slowly reload while you watch a little semicircle bar timer near your crosshair, thus providing an excellent opportunity for teamwork, covering each other and feeling like you are really a squad of Space Marines. This is a typical co-op convention. For switches and picking up items, you get a floating press E or whatever button, and a circle indicator fills up when you hold down the button. This exists for twofold reasons. It prevents multiple players attempting to interact with the same item simultaneously, and it once again provides excellent opportunity for teamwork, covering one another and other co-op synergies. None of these things would be necessary in single player, and I found them annoying, and they sometimes got me killed. Not that big of a deal, but that was just one little thing. More obviously a completely co-op feature is if you die, you don't die, you go down on the ground, one of your companions has to revive you. Wind up down there too many times without having found a special item, and you die permanently. I, of course, would have much preferred to just die and reboot the game from the last checkpoint as soon as possible, rather than sit around watching the bots work out how to revive me. They do prioritize reviving you in single player, thank God, but there were a few times where I died somewhere unreachable and I had to wait until I died via timeout. This is an absolutely shit thing to sit through in a single player game, and it screamed at me that I wasn't really meant to be playing this by myself because I went down a lot. Of course, it meant I got a second chance at some difficult bits that I probably would have died again and again at otherwise, but honestly, I think I would have preferred that, as it would have helped develop my skills at the game. I feel like I relied way too much on those bots. Although, admittedly, that's once again just a personal preference. If you'd played co-op with friends, this obviously would have been great. The gold left for dead standard of how to handle this mechanic. Now, what for me was the most frustrating and indisputably shit thing about being a single player in a multiplayer intended experience, well, that was co-op tasks and arenas, and for a twofold reason. So to explain what I mean, the game is brimming with sections where someone, say, has to hold down a switch that takes some time while the others fend off the bad guys to protect him. Or you have to work together to knock bad guys off an objective. Or someone's got to use the flamethrower on the critters while the other two defend him from the big monsters, and other similar outright co-op tasks. In single player, the mobs most definitely preference targeting you over your bot companions. Not entirely, but most of the time. The bots are pretty good, but they cannot compensate for real human players covering you. And so the game was full of me just trying to do the damn objectives that the bots cannot do and are not programmed to try to do it all, only to be getting killed over and over while I was helpless doing them. This just seemed like outright bad game design, like I shouldn't have been able to play the game on that difficulty at all without other human players. Now, of course, this is just how it felt at times. There are ways to manage, and I did overcome the challenges, but one of these moments is what caused me to change the difficulty down, and I think for some players like me, this moment is notorious, where you are on top of a satellite dish defending antennas from a swarm of flying Tyranid gargoyles, while regular Tyranid mobs try to kill you at the same time. This was such an obvious co-op arena, and with multiple antennas coming under attack simultaneously and no way to defend myself from the mobs while defending the antennas, I eventually got fed up and changed the difficulty to veteran, and that solved it. I was able to get past it on the first try once I did that. Later, this same challenge repeats, but instead of antennas on a satellite dish, it was chains on a cargo lift, and while I didn't beat that first time, it took a couple of tries, I still did get past it on veteran by myself. These moments were particularly illustrative for me as to why I disliked the co-op design as a single player so much. As a co-op challenge, it's a perfectly legitimate way to design. It forces teamwork synergy, occupies everybody, makes you rapidly switch between defending one another while pursuing objectives, makes for hectic communication, and a great feeling of accomplishment. By myself, it just made me wish these fucking bots would shoot the fucking gargoyles too, or at least defend me while I did it, or at the very least draw some goddamn fucking fire off me while I did it. It was really annoying, in other words, and not fun at all. The worst thing about it, though, isn't even difficulty or gameplay related. The worst thing about it is it's shit for telling a story in a story-focused campaign. It feels like a deeply contrived, purely gameplay scenario that has no basis for existing as anything other than a situation for a co-op video game. It takes me out of the Space Marine trademark experience and makes me feel like I'm playing Left 4 Dead Online, and I wasn't even online. The game was honestly full of moments like that, where you are watching the Tyranids pile up and not climb a wall instantly for purely co-op timing gameplay reasons. Or you were spinning a damn wheel slowly instead of instantly pressing a button so that a teammate can cover you. If the game had been single-player focused, these things would never have been in it, and instead they could have just gotten on with telling the story in a cinematic way. On top of that, there's content that was made and has been reserved for the Operations co-op PvE mode of gameplay that I swear if the game had been single-player would have just been in the campaign. I was especially disappointed taking down the Hive Tyrant wasn't a part of Titus's story in the campaign, but reserved for a PvE operation instead. I know it's unfair to what if the game like that, but I genuinely feel that the campaign's rhythm, momentum, and storytelling potential at times was completely hamstrung by the co-op gameplay comes first design of the game. If I had been co-oping it, of course, I wouldn't have felt that way. And even if I'd been playing it on easy, I still would have been rolling my eyes on top of that satellite dish, wondering why I was arbitrarily playing a Defend the Objective multiplayer game instead of learning more about Titus and Project Aurora. Yes, I know that they came up with a reason for you to do it, but the reason was super basic. They could have come up with anything. Hell, it could have been a dreaded turret section even. Or you calling in air support or another squad or squads rocking in and shooting them. Like, it's not hard, had it not been a requirement for a fun co-op experience, to have had something far less contrived in there that actively aided in helping you feel like an ultramarine instead of like an online gamer. The game, for me, was at its absolute worst, not because of the difficulty, but because of the sheer lack of immersiveness and clunkiness of the gameplay when it was putting you through heavily co-op based sections as a single player with bots. So, yeah, I don't recommend playing the game by yourself if you can help it. These sections would feel far more necessary, natural, and most of all fun if you were working together with friends. So, I mean, that's my bad, but given the nature of the game this one was a sequel to, can you really blame me for being a bit disappointed that the single player felt so compromised by the multiplayer aspect? I know the original game had some pretty straight up wait for an elevator to arrive gamey sections, but they were nowhere near as obtuse as what Space Marine 2 pulls. I also have to mention that I did feel absurdly fragile in this game. Once again, okay, turn the difficulty down, problem solved. I accept that. Also, if there's 3 humans playing, it's probably an appropriate amount of fragility to counter how dangerous 3 competent players must be. So much so, I hear they have planned an even harder difficulty coming out soon. Also, the mechanics do exist to keep you in the fight. The teammate pickups, if you get wounded, give you a second chance. And you can do some degree of health recovery and armor recovery by dealing damage and performing executions and successful parries with the counter pistol shot thing afterward. And believe me, I did these as often as I could, otherwise I would never have beat the campaign. Not even close, but I was crap at them, I admit. Nevertheless, on these hard difficulties, it takes like 3 or 4 hits and you are down. 1 hit from a tough enemy annihilates your armor, and if they are really tough, some of your HP too. Sometimes you can't afford to get hit twice by a really tough opponent. Okay, that's fair enough, I can work with that, but what really stumped me was the shitty little runt enemies only need to touch you 3 or 4 times to kill you, and there are literally swarms of the fuckers everywhere, like upwards of 50 or more, targeting almost exclusively you, and yes, while the execution animations make you invulnerable, nothing else does. You can be hit mid-dodge, mid-parry, mid-counter pistol shot, mid-reload, mid-picking up stuff. I don't mean to imply you should be invulnerable for these things. I just mean to say that I was constantly trying to not get hit by one thing, only to find something else would shoot me as I was avoiding or parrying the other thing, or trying to pull off a combo. I constantly felt like I was damned if I do, damned if I don't, like there was never a right answer other than dying constantly. I admit, I suck at the game, and I can see a skilled player who didn't struggle so much with the controls and had a much better head on their shoulders for executing and navigating the combos wouldn't have had as much trouble as me, but it just didn't feel like I was a power-armoured super soldier. It felt like I was more fragile than the virtually unarmoured Imperial Guardsmen I was fighting alongside with, and I can guarantee I was 100% taking less damage than my bot squad mates. Either that or they literally were not being hit because everything was targeting me instead. They went down a fraction as often as I did. And that also didn't gel at all with the story the game was trying to tell. Here you are, a several centuries old veteran who's fought Tyranids before, with all this dialogue giving your squad mates who've never fought them before sage advice, and they almost never go down, and you are getting helped up by them every 10 seconds. It was absurdly stupid. If they had any sense, they'd ignore my advice and start telling me what to do. Yes, it might just be me who had that experience because I suck at the game. I should have turned the difficulty down, I know. Or, the game could have made me as tough as them, or targeted them as often as me, or made the bolt gun actually useful. Once again, I do put all that on me. It's a consequence of me choosing the harder difficulty and the game design aimed at co-op rather than single player, with a healthy dollop of me just sucking. I mentioned earlier that something did change for me though. This is where the spoilers start, but just like the first game and a dozen other Warhammer games and 100 other Warhammer stories, chaos shows up halfway through the game and turn out to be the real enemy all along. Wouldn't be Space Marine without it, would it? I actually found chaos to be a lot easier to manage than the Tyranids. I still died plenty, but I made progress so much faster, and the back half of the game was practically a breeze in comparison. This is funny because I've noticed online a lot of people complaining that chaos is way harder. So once again, it might just be a me thing, but I just could not figure out how to deal with the swarms of Tyranids effectively. I understood that you needed to crowd control the swarm and target the big nids first. As you wipe them out, they wipe out the smaller nids too, just like in Dawn of War 2, but I just could not figure it out reliably. I was really bad at reading the nid animations. I kept on getting hit by Hormagaunts or Termagaunts in the back and killed while mid-animation parrying or dodging a warrior, or I'd try to execute a combo to get an AoE off to do some crowd control, and in the middle of the animation I'd get hit and die before it went off. I just struggled to get the timing right and to manage all of the competing interests literally swarming me. Once again, if ranged had been far more effective, I feel like that would have gone a long way in aiding with this, as well as being able to bind the melee combos to 2 buttons instead of 1. I found chaos so much easier just because they were spaced so much more generously, and I could read them as an opponent so much easier and dodge and parry them far more effectively. On one hand, sure, this is probably a good thing in terms of an accurate depiction of fighting Tyranids. They would be an absolute nightmare to deal with, swarming all around you and never giving you a chance to understand which way an attack is coming. On the other, in terms of an escalating gameplay arc, it was bizarre having the game suddenly become like 200% easier halfway through and stay that way. Games usually get harder as they go. On top of that, there's also a disconnect between how the characters act, treating the Tyranids as the far lesser threat, when in the gameplay I found them far more dangerous. Lore-wise, I also found this a little odd, and felt that the Tyranids got a little bit downplayed in this game by the character dialogue and attitudes compared to the actual depiction of them on the ground and in combat. Once again, it might just be me, and I have a feeling if I were to go back and replay the campaign, having finally gotten fairly used to the combat by the end of the game, I might not struggle so much with the Tyranids, but yeah, they absolutely kicked my ass, and I was grateful when Chaos showed up. Inquisition take me, heresy be damned. Let's get into the really fun stuff, seeing as I'm beginning to brush on it now anyway. The characters in the story and the plot, and we may as well start by going back and hitting new game, which gives you a smaller version of the settings menu first up, which is an exceedingly polite touch from Saber, including the all-important helmet on-off button, which I kept on coming back to and toggling during the game. If Saber wanted to listen to me about a second thing, I'd recommend a third option, which is to have the helmet automatically on during combat and automatically off when you were chilling on your big ship. Although, I will note, if you were a stickler for consistency, pre-rendered cutscenes assume that the helmet is off all the time, and that can occasionally be a little jarring, seeing it just disappear and reappear in a mid-combat cutscene. So the smoothest option is definitely just to keep the helmet off all the time. After you've picked some settings, you get the difficulty select. It's really nice they put the settings in there for gamers who aren't like me and obsessively check out settings before they hit new game, as almost always, no matter who you are, there are things you're going to want to change. Anyway, the difficulty. I've gone on about this a lot. I highly recommend, if you are by yourself and just want to play a fun game and feel like a Space Marine, to pick one of the easy difficulties. But if there are 3 of you co-oping and you tend to be good at video games in general, absolutely go for the hardest setting in my view. You'll die, but you'll beat it and have a lot of fun doing it. Don't select the hardest difficulty by yourself unless you are confident you are very good at this kind of game, which is not me. And I wish I'd listened to that wisdom just because I was able to handle bolt gun. It's a very different style of video game. Once you select the difficulty, we get a couple of classic grimdark short sentences to give newbies something to contextualize the setting and to give old hands the tingles. And then, unlike the first game, our opening cinematic isn't a wisely economic affair in terms of rendering, but is instantly, gloriously high-fidelity details and action as a Tyranid hive fleet invades a planet called Kadaku, to the presumable annoyance of the local guardsmen. Then we get a computer interface callback to the 2011 game's introduction. It gives us some context. It names the Tyranids, mentions that they can't bombard the planet because of something called Project Aurora that's too valuable. It shows you that access is denied to more information about Project Aurora because it's classified, and it's so important that something must be done, so they call in the Space Marines. Almost beat for beat a callback to 2011 Space Marine with Titans swapped out for Project Aurora, whatever that is. Then we get another very expensive shiny cinematic featuring cool hooded Deathwatch kill team Space Marines entering the atmosphere with something called a virus bomb, only to get swarmed by Tyranid gargoyles before they even land, resulting in one of them getting knocked from their ship and plummeting into the jungle. End cutscene. Start in-game rendering. You are that Space Marine. You pick yourself up off the jungle floor, watch your ship crash, establish that your communication devices ain't working properly, and you stop to watch the pretty scenery of lasgun shooting, air defenses firing, and splosioning. Once again, sorry about my footage here. For some reason, it's dropping heaps of frames and looks like shit. And I don't remember it playing like that, and plenty of my later recordings appear to be free of the issue, although plenty of them have this issue. I have a theory, as mentioned earlier, that my computer just couldn't handle recording and playing this game at the same time. It was being stretched to its limit, and so the recording suffered. I don't have better footage, however, and my videos are more about the audio than the actual gameplay footage. I mean, if I had a better computer, I wish I had great footage, but I don't. So, unprofessional me is just going to have to run with this really crappy, choppy, laggy footage. I do apologize. I'll try not to include as much of it as I can, but some of it is just essential, so sorry about that. Anyway, to make a long story short, the rest of the Deathwatch squad die. Your playable Marine turns out to be our hero Titus, of course. You manage to launch the virus bomb by yourself, although it doesn't really change much except slow the Tyranids down. And despite achieving that, you still manage to get impaled by a Carnifex. Fortunately, some unseen Ultramarine heavy bolters its face off, and Titus wakes up aboard the battle barge Resilient with some gnarly scars and a skelly-themed chaplain letting you know that you were killed but have been brought back through hectic surgery that's turned you into a Primaris Marine. Something that had to happen, as that's the minis Games Workshop are selling these days. And so that's 2 of the big questions lingering from 2011 Space Marine answered. 1. What happened to Titus after the Inquisition took him? Answer, he served penance with the Deathwatch, a kind of Space Marine extracurricular exchange student alien killing suicide mission club, which makes sense if you know the lore. And 2, how was he going to become a Primaris so Games Workshop could push their newer lore and minis? And the answer to that is Deathwatch Titus tried and failed to solo a Carnifex, and old Chapter Master Marnius Calgar was so impressed he had you surgically altered into the next-gen super soldier to save your life. Then the chaplain tells you you have been reassigned to your old chapter of the Ultramarines because after a century of penance in the Deathwatch, you've earned your way back to your old family. Though Mr. Chaplin is all like, but you gotta earn our love again. You've been gone for 100 years, old boy. We Primaris now, we Primaris. Next to no one knows who you are anymore. So you swear the Ultramarine oath while you get kitted out in blue again, and bam, it's logo time. Then we're back in the game. The Chaplain is a high-strung, high-standards dick to you. And, where might we have seen that before? And then we are free to wander around the Space Marine ship. The details here are incredible, and I went out of my way to film this damn flying baby to show off just how far they went to make sure that what's unique about 40k pops. Anyone who knows about the lore does know about cherubs. I wasn't surprised to see one, but I was very glad to see one rendered and made so obvious. They must be quite the fun thing for anyone new to the setting to witness. After that, you go to the bridge, which is also incredible in all its detail and has an amazing view. You get to meet the Scottish, borg-eyed Captain Acheran, who makes it clear you aren't a captain anymore, but are a lieutenant now, and you better not be trouble, you'd better be a good blue boy. And he sends you off promptly with 2 new friends to go help the guard get some really big guns going so they can blow up some Tyranid ships to get their ships through and evacuate the planet. That's the setup. I, of course, won't step-by-step the whole game, but we are going to try and talk all the major plot points through so that we can have a discussion about it after. But my god, do some of these early parts of the game show off some of the most graphically impressive, atmosphere-drenched, active war zones a game has ever depicted. It's just the sheer amount of Tyranid models moving in the background and flying in the sky. And so many of them you can actually shoot. It's genuinely crazy. It's not a skybox. It's some sort of weird hybrid. It does amazing things for your perspective. This game, like the previous one, does go from giant cool set piece to giant cool set piece. And while it clearly has a much, much bigger budget to use well than the last game, it still does sometimes resort to the same corner cutting and shortcuts for the less important set pieces, like get a load of this cutscene. When you do get the big guns operating as per the mission, it's hardly a detailed animation of a Tyranid ship getting torn up by planetary defense weaponry. It is a bit of a corner cut, but given all the amazing stuff in this game, it's highly forgivable and good direction. It's not like it's a supremely important moment. Anyway, I mean, if I haven't said spoilers enough, just like, here is your big red blaring neon sign blinking spoilers, because from this point on, like, I'm really going to give it all away. But the major plot of the game involves you rescuing a Mechanicus Archmagos, because he's in charge of Project Aurora. But oh no, he gets killed when his Thunderhawk is sabotaged, and it's pretty obvious Chaos did it because they can't resist being all occult and putting runes and shit everywhere and impaling the dude on an ominous spike. From the wreckage you pull a hectic container, and Titus has a bad reaction to it. And anyone who played the first game would be having a bit of deja vu right now, and probably has a pretty damn good idea what's in the container. Fortunately, the game doesn't try and make it a big mystery for very long, and Titus tells Captain Acheran it's mighty suspicious Chaos Boys killed the Archmagos but didn't steal the container. Acheran sends you off to find the Archmagos' apprentice Luz because Aurora is some kind of really important weapon and he's the only one who knows anything about it. He's on a nearby Imperial City planet that is also being invaded by Tyranids, and my god are the views in the city incredible. With spaceships in the atmosphere, spires and gun emplacements, and just the most amazing detail. It really is a pleasure to fight with the views in this city. Eventually you find Luz's research facility, which lets you know that, what a surprise, the artifact MacGuffin from the first game was in the container, and is at the centre of Project Aurora, which Titus obviously doesn't take well. After some hullabaloo with the reactor, you confront Acheran about your previous experience in the first game with the MacGuffin, but he won't hear a word about it because the Ultramarines' big boss Gulliman has ordered Project Aurora, and he warns you to back off if you don't want more Inquisition times. Anyway, you still haven't found Luz, so back to the city planet you go, where you deal with more Tyranids and eventually come across a bunch of guardsmen in the central administration building who you discover are traitors, working with Chaos, but not before they blow up a friendly Marine, which sends one of your squad mates into a fit of rage that basically doesn't end up being relevant. From this point on, the game pivots to being about Chaos, specifically the Thousand Suns Legion and the Zinch faction of Chaos. This is also where I found the game began to get a lot easier for me personally, and I stopped dying quite as much, but I find a lot of people online completely disagree about that, but your mileage may vary. Feel free to comment on whether you found the Tyranids or the Chaos harder, or maybe you found them about the same. So after kicking a bunch of Chaos butt, you find Luz, bring him back to your boss, who is mad that Chaos are here and feels like they are in a real pickle fighting both the Tyranids and Chaos at once. So he wants to use Aurora to beat them, which of course Titus knows is a stupid thing to do, as last time he tried to use the MacGuffin as a weapon, he opened a giant warp portal and that caused a Chaos invasion. Fortunately, Acheron turns out to not be a complete idiot and lets Titus put together a plan to send a message to not their big boss Gulliman, but their regular big boss Marneus Calgar. Only problem is they can't get to the only psychic astropath who can send the message because Tyranids are in the way and there's some jamming going on. The plan involves taking out the Hive Tyrant to throw the Tyranids into confusion and doing something about the jamming, but that's PvE operations content and not in the campaign. But hey, at least you get to see the Space Marines working together and not the hero just doing everything, so there is a silver lining, but as mentioned earlier, I really would have preferred if that Hive Tyrant boss battle had been in the main campaign, but oh well, can't win it all. Also, hilariously, around here in the game for me, for some reason in cutscenes, the little armor flappies on their hips started standing up and clipping through their hands all the time. So that's pretty funny. Watch out for it in the rest of my footage. Before you deploy to go send your message, you get confronted by your squad mate, Pretty Boy McPrettyface, who has been reading about you in the archives and wants to know your story, and you brush him off, but get forced to reveal you'd been accused of heresy and had to give up the Ultramarines because of it and join the Death Watch and la-di-da-di-da plot of the first game. Anyway, your plan goes well in terms of the Hive Tyrant being killed and the jamming being dealt with, but your squad mate is getting pretty damn sick of your shit and is highly suspicious of you and gets all charge ahead stroppy to prove it. You do get to the Astropath Psychic to send the message, but it goes awry and she starts accusing you of heresy. Your squad mate believes her and the tension between you hits its climax and he tries to kill you, only for your other squad mate to assess the situation accurately while you are tussling and he shoots the Astropath, who turns out to have had her mind used as a portal by the Chaos Sorcerer Imara and actual bad guy antagonist of the game. Cue boss fight. You beat him but don't kill him. With the Chaos Cat out of the bag, Aurora is no secret no more and the Ultramarines are heading over to a third world where Luz and Aurora are located. The Chaos have a big structure on this world that gives them power, and your previously suspicious, historically minded Pretty Boy squad mate comes up with a plan for them to use an ancient ship that was buried on the planet to ram the big Chaos power structure. And while that's another PvE operation you don't get to play, you get to plant the beacon the ship needs to navigate in order to do the ramming. First, you need to deploy to the planet by jump packing through space and burning ship wreckage in a glorious callback to the first game. Your squad mates discuss it before you start. They make up for their previous fussin' and a feudin', and in an amazing about-face from the first game's famous meme line, your squad mate says, "The Codex Astartes does not support this action, but I am looking forward to it." Confetti flies, everybody cheers. It's a really nice moment. You dodge the wreckage, fight the chaos, plant the beacon. Your off-screen squad mates are successful and the ship rams the power thingo. Then you delve into the Aurora facility, which turns out to be full of chaos, and a Necron tomb, although fortunately the Necrons are deactivated, but may very well be foreshadowing for some DLC or sequel in the future involving them. It would seem Aurora combines the old MacGuffin from the last game with some Necron tech. You find Luz, who activates Project Aurora by flipping a little Necron doohickey over, and it makes it seem like chaos cannot exist in its radius of effect, as well as giving Luz a nifty force field. But then Imra reveals it was all a chaos ruse, and actually, of course, the MacGuffin and Project Aurora didn't do shit to chaos, but instead opened a giant warp portal, just like last time. And just as planned, says Imra, who kills Luz, and somehow you and your squad escape the collapsing Necron catacombs off screen, which I thought was very funny. Now, from this point, the game steps on the gas and gets really good, so I'll forgive it for making our protagonists magically immune to the good old rocks fall, everyone dies routine. You fight your way back to Akaran and come up with a last-ditch plan to try and assault the pillar that contains the new warp portal, which is immune to ordnance from their big spaceship, but seems to be assaultable on foot. Things are looking grim, the Ultramarines seem to be on the back foot with very little forces left and Chaos looking stronger than ever. As you approach the portal, the good old chapter standard or Ultramarine flag they like to carry into battle for morale reasons has fallen, and you go and pick it up. Cue the best moment in the game, and I've got to be honest, I just about fucking cried when this happened. Not because it was sad, but because it was genuinely like seeing a piece of art from my childhood come to life. I used to sit and stare at the classic Space Marine Last Stand on a Hill pictures that were oh so common back in the day. It is one of the most iconic scenes in Warhammer 40,000, and here I was in the middle of one playing it out. I couldn't believe it. I was so happy. It was so cool. Of course, what happens next is that just before you all get overwhelmed and die, Marneus Calgar turns up with reinforcements because before the astropath got her brain puppeted by Imra, she had in fact got the message out. Now you have the breathing room, you come up with a plan and work out that just like Luz turned the Necron doohickey over, if you can turn a bunch more over, you might solve the problem. Then Marneus gives a speech, a fucking Lord of Change shows up through the portal and is absolutely massive as you and a bunch of Marines and tanks charge it. You and your squad find the doohickey, and rather than you, Mr. Hero Man, flipping it over, your little pretty boy Squatty does, showing that indeed teamwork and the power of ultra friendship is the answer after all. The Necron doohickey flips over a big obelisk version of the doohickey that shoots a big green Necron beam into the portal that makes it and the Lord of Change smaller, and it seems your plan works. You have 3 more to do, 2 of which are PvE operations, and 1 is part of the campaign. There is one more real cool sequence involving a Dreadnought and a Helldrake. Then your other squad mate gets to flip his doohickey, and just before the portal closes for good, your squad follows Marneus Calgar into the warp for the final boss battle with Imra. It is suitably difficult and also involves the Lord of Change. You, of course, prevail in the end and save the day, successfully destroy the MacGuffin, and are redeemed and presented a fancy helmet before being told you are being flown away for some new important mission, coming to you in a DLC or sequel, who knows when. Right before you get on the Thunderhawk to DLC land, you are confronted one final time by the chaplain, who is still suspicious of you being traitorous, and he takes his mask off, and lo and behold, in the most obvious reveal of all time, it's Leandros from the first game. I mean, the chaplain was the only guy in a mask. He was literally the only person who could be Leandros. They weren't going to make him a nameless background helmet marine, and the only other marine who never takes his helmet off, who even vaguely qualifies as a character, dies shortly after you meet him. I had this reveal picked in the opening of the game, but it certainly sets us up for whatever comes next as tense, and it makes heaps of sense that the by-the-book Goody Two-Shoes Leandros would become an authority figure by the book enforcer, like a chaplain. He was always going to be a cop. Come on. Anyway, now old Calgar is on your side. Let's see how he can fuck with you now. If we're lucky, they'll pair you up on the next mission for the grim dankest version of the odd couple you've ever seen. I just want to note that I accidentally didn't record a bit of the end game, and seeing as my footage already sucks and this video is already not a particularly good one, I'm not going to bother replaying it and capturing it. So you're just going to have to pretend that I have footage of Titus destroying the MacGuffin artifact with his fists, or you can just look it up. But that was one of the only questions that was raised by the original game, and indeed also this one, that Space Marine 2 doesn't answer. Why is Titus immune and or highly resistant to the artifact and warp fuckery and energy in general? Other than the fact he's hero McProtagonist face. Is he chosen by the Emperor? Does he have some kind of warp taint going on like Leandros is convinced? Is he connected to the artifact in some explicit way? Is it something else entirely? Maybe he's a secret Necron experiment. I don't know. But of all the questions and major plot points to leave a mystery, this was probably the safest one, and provides one little hook to explore later in sequels or DLC featuring the Titus Bobitus. Other than that, as mentioned, we satisfactorily get great explanations for most of where we left off in Space Marine 1. In the intervening time, Titus was in the Death Watch as penance. Leandros became a chaplain. And by heroing a little too hard, Titus gets some Primaris upgrades. The game doesn't really raise many new questions, however. There's just that lingering old one of why Titus is so special. Aside from that, there is the interpersonal ones, like how Titus and Leandros will get along, and what is the new mission hook given at the end of the game. A decidedly more wrapping things up with a pretty bow on the end kind of ending than the original, which is justified given we were left hanging on the cliff for 13 years with the original, as smart a move as that turned out to be. Just like the original, what's great about this game is not the big plot points you move between. In fact, this game has the same goddamn plot as the original game. It really is virtually identical. To simplify, there's an invasion by a Xenos force. In the first game it's Orcs, in the second it's Tyranids, and about halfway through Chaos turn up when the same MacGuffin is developed into a weapon, this time by the Mechanicus instead of the Inquisition. And when used, it opens a warp portal for Chaos instead of working as intended, and Titus has to kick some Chaos Space Marine butt and close the warp portal, bookended with Leandros being a dick. The plot points have never really been the selling point of these games, and it's not where Space Marine 2 shines either. It's in the character work and how it plays off the dynamics from the original game that this one really shines. It's in Titus dealing with being a mistrusted, demoted underdog instead of being a heroic paragon of virtue captain. It's in your squad mates being contentious for actual good reasons, and Titus emotionally and honestly settling it with them eventually in an act of emotional maturity that is extraordinarily rare in Warhammer 40k. Following on from that, and the callback to the jump pack scene with the Codex not supporting this action, now they are on the other side of their conflict and emotional resolution. You have this perfect foundation for them to trust Titus and then embrace his unconventional, Codex-defying thinking and try it on for themselves with enthusiasm and excitement, which leads to Pretty Boy using his nerdy, scholarly tendencies to come up with the solutions to beating Chaos later in the game. While the plot is the same as the original game, the character journey is the inverse. Titus literally gets a second chance to play out the same thing, and we see him go to the brink of making the same mistakes before making a breakthrough on how to be vulnerable and communicative with his brothers, earn their trust, and through that, this time gets to put the artifact that was at the centre of the last century of his emotional turmoil out of action for good. This understanding by Saber of Titus's character genuinely makes me excited to see where they might go in exploring Leandros in further content, as it would seem Titus has learnt his lessons, and now it might be Leandros' turn. He does seem awful angry, perhaps a fall is coming for him next. The understanding of Titus as not an island of success by himself, but an agent intertwined in his family for success also prevents the game into falling into a trap that is all too common, and I thought was coming for most of the game, which is treating everyone except the protagonist as an idiot. When Captain Acheran actually finally lets Titus act on his knowledge about the artifact and put together the plan to send help to Calgar. When your squaddy Chiron realizes the astropath has fallen to chaos and shoots them while you and the pretty boy are about to kill each other. And then the pretty boy having all these great plans later. I love that the game does not fall back on the action hero cliche of only the protagonist knows best. And then, as the audience/player, we don't sit there and scream at them, "No, you idiots, how can you act purely out of plot contrivance and have no sense all of the time?" The character that does act like a blind, plot-contrived idiot is the Mechanicus tech priest Luz. And he is never seen in the game working closely with anyone else, and it's easy to see how his mechanical dedication to his hubris gets him in the end, given there are no reasonable voices or culture around him. Just your blue boys, whom he does not provide the respect to in terms of possibly understanding the artifact that would allow him to listen to them, despite Titus informing him that he has some serious experience with the artifact. Whereas the first game is a story of an ultramarine, the second game is the story of an ultra family, and only those that live, love, and fight as that family and respect it make it to the end of the game. As proof of this, what truly makes the second game stand out is not just the set pieces, but the set pieces that entangle the wider Ultramarine chapter, their equipment, and their characters and heroes. The original game was cool because it gave you a glimpse into how a squad could save a world. This game gives you a good long stare into how an entire Ultramarine company saves a system. The most successful thing about the game is its macro view of Titus as a cog in the wider Ultramarine machine. Sure, he's a particularly grunty, shiny cog, but unlike the first game, he does not and cannot do this by himself, and it is immensely satisfying to see the dynamics of the wider Ultra Machine at work. And so the climax of the game, featuring Chapter Master Marnius Calgar, a whole bunch of their big vehicles and dreadnoughts and ships, and that iconic last stand lifted straight out of the old school artwork, is the natural conclusion to thinking about Titus as that cog instead of making him the be-all and end-all of the game, and I couldn't be happier with the result. What a thrill. What a rush. Bringing the imagination of the tabletop to life in front of my eyes. Ultimately, these fantastic, unforgettable moments of the entire chapter bringing its full power to bear against the gigantic demon won me completely over, and would I suffer through all that gameplay frustration I had so I could experience it all for the first time again? Absolutely I would. It's worth it, for someone like me who loves Warhammer 40,000. Now, one thing I do wonder is if Bolt Gun's plot actually ties in with this at all, seeing as it is also about an Ultramarine dealing with the same artifact on the planet from the first game and must take place sometime between Space Marine 1 and 2. But I would wager it's just as likely not canon and just a bit of fun. If I want great gameplay that makes me come alive, Bolt Gun is still the game for me. Gaming Grandpa Brain understands how that game works. But my god, Space Marine 2 has taken the crown and by a long way in terms of depicting the Warhammer 40,000 setting as it appears, at least in my imagination. This game is a tabletop army brought to life, and I'm absolutely certain Games Workshop is going to be selling Primaris Ultramarines for a long, long time. Thanks for listening, like and subscribe. Captain no longer, the lieutenant scowls. The great devourer swarms, scurries and howls. His brothers beside him, bolters in hand. They know no fear as their thunderbird lands. Before them bugs melt, screech and dismember. There is no grief, no pain nor surrender. An immolation and a trace around flies. Fire, blood and ash scar the night skies. Before me lies wrath, and behind me only death. The lieutenant cries with bloodlust on his breath. I hold the standard high as a beacon for all. 'Tis our actions cause the devourer to fall. But a guard out of place and lasfire wide gives treason the wind upon which to ride. A rift rents asunder the emperor's hegemony. The lieutenant and brothers face the great enemy.